The US economy has had several major economic hits these past few years. All of these hits in the past ranging from the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation, war in Ukraine, and even Chinese lockdowns all seem to drive the US economy towards a recession. Earlier this year, March to be precise, Wall Street titans warned that a recession was imminent and that there were warning signs we needed to understand. As the year prepares to close, many Americans are beginning to get terribly worried about the economy, and their worry is not without reason. The economy is going down at a rate so fast that people barely have the time to prepare. The cost of living is on a steady rise due to increased prices. Everything from energy to food to furniture is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the average American. Hardworking Americans are getting fed up because now they're experiencing a decline in their standard of living, seeing that the cost of living keeps rising but wages are remaining the same way. In 2020, during the first quarter, when COVID hit and began spreading across the US, the American economy suffered a 5% decline in economic growth. By the second quarter, the economy was already at a 31.4% decline. Although it recovered and made a 33.1% boost by the third quarter, it was recorded that not even that boost was enough to make up for initial losses. Because of the laws put in place to manage the spread of the disease, jobs and businesses had to close down. This resulted in the unemployment rate rising to about 4.7% as of April. By July, the unemployment rate had skyrocketed to about twice the initial rise. Adding to businesses in America closing down, the Chinese lockdowns led to businesses closing down in China. In keeping with the lockdown rules and regulations, the port of Shanghai, which is one of the world's busiest ports, had to halt its operations. Statistically, Chinese export growth experienced a free fall from 15.7% to 3.7% between March and April, according to a report by the Associated Press. Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Vermont, Richard Sickett, said industrial production in China fell in April 2022 by 3% compared to April 2021. A large number of industries were affected. Raw materials like chemicals used in healthcare, materials used for making shoes, and construction materials are now in short supply. Not only that, American corporations were also negatively affected by the lockdown in China. Adidas, for instance, in the first quarter of 2021, reported that its net income decreased from $502 million down to $310 million. Under Armour reported also that they experienced a net loss of $60 million compared to a net income of $78 million last year. The reason for this, according to what Sickett said, is that many American corporations own factories or retail outlets in China, and they are most likely in joint ventures with these Chinese firms. Many of the rest that do not own factories or retail outlets in China contract with Chinese firms for parts or finished goods. Either that or they produce their products under licensing agreements. And then, while households are still trying to get a hold of themselves and their families and managing the fallout of the COVID breakout, they are still faced with another stumbling block, which is inflation. Inflation basically is the economic term used to describe the increase in prices of goods and services. Inflation has many ways it affects every economy, and the US economy is no different. Lately, due to inflation, many Americans are being faced with lesser purchasing power. And this is the most obvious because now people who could afford certain items at former prices can no longer do that, therefore causing them to manage with the maximum they can afford. For many Americans, this has greatly reduced their quality of living, and this is as true for households as it is for each individual American. When Angelo Di Candia, a professor of business at Touro University, spoke about this, he commented that essentials would have to take precedence over non-essentials, as everyone is trying to stretch the purchase side of their budget. According to him, more money will be spent on groceries and gasoline and less spent on travel and entertainment. And that really makes sense. No sane person will be thinking of traveling the world on a backpack when they haven't had enough to eat. Aside from having a lesser purchasing power, inflation also means lesser savings for families and households. Come to think of it, If you only keep spending money on the essentials because of high prices, how much really is left for you to save? You probably will be putting little or no money at all into your savings. In a June 2022 Forbes survey, it was found that 42% of the people being interviewed were saving less than they formerly did. The idea is inflation never leaves a positive imprint on any economy because people are then forced to live in ways that they do not want to, buy things that they normally would not prefer to buy, and do things they do not like, all in order to survive. And for many, this is really saddening. Speaking of sad occurrences and things that have imparted the US economy in the past few months, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not left out of this conversation. You might be wondering why everyone is still talking about the Russian invasion, why it is a big deal, and how it affects the American economy. That is, why are people even adding it to the list of things they fear will wreck the US economy? The answer is simple. You see, Russia ranks in the top 5 producers of steel, nickel, and aluminum, and is the world's 3rd largest producer of oil. Russia exports more wheat than any other country in the world, almost 20% of all exports. Ukraine, on the other hand, is in the top 10 producers of rapeseed, sugar beet, barley, soya, and sunflowers, and is a major grower of corn, 6th biggest, wheat, 7th largest, and sunflowers, 1st. The day the invasion started, financial markets all across the world had a dramatic decline, while prices for commodities like metals, food, and energy all saw increases. Brent oil prices exceeded $100 per barrel for the first time since 2014 as a result of recent developments. The invasion did not affect the US alone, but the world in general. But the fallout of the attack is still being felt heavily in the United States to this day. The attack brought about a disruption in supply chains and limited the supply of wheat, oil, and natural gas. All of these have been said to peak inflation. Because of the war, analysts say there was a surge in imports even as exports fell, making the economy worse than it was before now. The rest of the world is feeling the economic implications mostly through rising commodity prices, which worsens already existing inflationary pressures. As is customary, when commodity prices rise, net importers of energy and food items are excessively affected, raising the prospect of substantial supply disruptions in the case of a further escalation of the war. Now that the midterm elections are over, Americans are wondering what this means for them and the US economy at large. Like any election, there are ways the results influence the economy for good or otherwise. Based on the concluded midterm election, for instance, a victory for Medicaid expansion in South Dakota means more healthcare that will be available for 42,000 Americans next year. This means Medicare expansion gets a win this time around. In anticipation of the Republican Party gaining control of the House and Senate, Social Security cutbacks were suggested in a late-stage budget plan. The idea would raise the age at which you can begin receiving Social Security payments from 67 to 70. The authors of this proposal stated that cuts were intended to keep Social Security sustainable for a longer length of time. This is at a time when the historic cost of living adjustment for 2023 may push the date when a trust fund that provides Social Security payments to seniors, persons with disabilities, and their dependents may run out of money. The Social Security Board of Trustees reported in June that the funds will run out by 2035. Cuts to Social Security payments are unlikely to occur since Republicans won't be in charge of the Senate, according to Alicia Munnell, director of Boston College's Center for Retirement Research. President Joe Biden said he would have stopped any cuts from happening if the GOP had taken over both houses. Munnell said the bottom line is that nothing is going to happen in the next 2 years with a divided Congress. And how about recession? The main topic of debate by world economists. Will the midterm election results influence it in any way? Americans could be on their own if a recession occurs next year, as most analysts anticipate. According to Brian Gardner, chief Washington policy strategist at Stifel, he said if the United States experiences a recession in 2023, a divided Congress will find it difficult to pass a fiscal stimulus bill, leaving the Federal Reserve as the primary institution in charge of determining economic policy in the nation. And we already know from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell that the Fed is committed to bringing inflation back to its 2% objective, down from 7.7% in October. Even if Powell stated in September that doing so would be painful for the public that we serve, Powell argued that it would ultimately be more unpleasant to let inflation soar any higher. So, it is either try to curb inflation or let recession fly. In the bid to curb recession still, there are looming consequences. But it is a lesser evil than allowing inflation escalate into a recession. Many Americans are coming to the realization of all of this, and it is just enough to get anyone freaked out.